Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages Podcast, Episode 63, Slay Queen. This is part 3 of a two-part episode on the life and times of Queen Brunhilda of Austrasia. And as you can probably guess from that introduction, things are not going according to plan. It's becoming very Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy around here, but I absolutely refuse to let this series go on for 4 episodes, so this is going to take as long as it takes. Word count and time target be damned. And in fact, in terms of word count, we have ended up here with the second longest episode I've ever written. So you've been warned. We're going to cover the second half or so of Brunhilda's life, when she really hit her stride as a political animal. And it's got to be said, she did not conduct herself in a way that would earn the approval of most modern observers. Actually, she didn't really earn the approval of contemporary observers either, and I'm just going to spoil it now. She came to a bad end. Before we really get going, though, I need to start with a correction from last time. A few of them, actually, namely regarding chronology. The thing about these here early Middle Ages is that nobody really has their calendars nailed down, and while deaths of kings and saints are usually recorded with some precision, birth dates very seldom are. Combine that with me rushing a little bit and being careless, and we end up here with me apologizing. So last time we left off with Brunhilda and her son Childebert returning from a period of exile, forced on them by the Austrasian nobility. They had fled to Guntram, Childebert's uncle and king of Burgundy, seeking protection and support. He had agreed, and the three had reached an agreement called the Treaty of Andalo. With that support, Childebert had returned to Austrasia, reclaimed his position, and driven out the nobles and magnates that had opposed him with some brutality. Now here comes the correction. Last time I said that the treaty had been completed while Childebert was still a minor, and that therefore the purge could be laid mostly at Brunhilda's feet. I was mistaken about that, and I apologize, for I got tangled in the web of conflicting sources and chroniclers. The truth is that at the time that Guntram, king of Burgundy, took Childebert and Brunhilda in under his protection, the king was probably around 17 years old. Now, I only know a handful of 17-year-olds that I would trust with the management of a Carl's Jr., but at the time he would have been considered fully ready to take over management of his kingdom as an equal to the other Merovingian kings. So in a way, that only serves to highlight Brunhilda's position, since she is named there as a party to the treaty right alongside her adult and legally competent son. I still assume, then, that Childebert's ferocious return to Austrasia was to a significant degree directed by Brunhilda, since she would have been the main voice educating the king about the politics back home, who to trust, and who to mullah. There is a second chronological boo-boo to clear up, namely the death of Chilperic, uncle of Childebert, and husband of Brunhilda's arch-rival Fredegund. Chilperic was assassinated in 584, which is before Brunhilda and Childebert were forced out of Austrasia, not after. He was stabbed by parties unknown while dismounting from his horse after a hunting expedition. I have not been especially sympathetic to Chilperic in these pages, generally painting him as jealous and petty and with a chip on his shoulder. In that I have largely been following the lead of Gregory of Tours, who did not like him one little bit. I'm not going to say that Gregory or I have been unfair, except to say that it is likely he was not as bad as depicted, just as his opponents, as we shall see, were not necessarily as good as they have so far been depicted. Chilperic was around 45 when he died, and had been king of Neustria for 23 years. He had produced 11 children over his life, 5 with his first wife, Audofeda, and a further 6 with his true partner, Fredegund. In spite of that, at the time of his death, only 2 legitimate offspring remained. A daughter named Rigonth, who was about 14 when he died, and who had a complicated relationship with her mother, and the infant Clothar, only 4 months old when Chilperic met his maker. So Fredegund found herself in much the same position that Brunhilda had been in when Sigebert died, but quickly secured her position as regent. The nobles who had been loyal to Chilperic swore to continue to support his son, and Fredegund even prevailed upon Guntram to extend his protection, which may have made things awkward between Guntram and Brunhilda for a while. In trying to explain Brunhilda's expulsion from Austrasia, I have reason to once again mention the Gundevald affair. mainly because it's one of the few incidents of intrigue where we have anything like a complete narrative, and so it is a well to which historians, and me, are forced to go again and again and again when piecing together the story of the Merovingians. This time round I need to tie it to Brunhilda and see what it tells us about her. My chronological incompetence appears one more time, since the appearance of Gundevald and his claim to Frankish kingship came before, or just around the same time, as Brunhilda and Childebert's expulsion from Austrasia, and may have been related to it. To quickly recap, Gundevald was a pretender who had claimed to be a son of Clothar I. Clothar refused to recognize his right to rule, and he spent some time in exile in Italy. Once Chilperic died, and there seemed to be an opening, he returned to Francia and claimed the loyalty of several cities, mainly in the south. He arrived suspiciously well funded, and many of the nobles who should have responded to kick this threat to their king's power out were suspiciously slow in doing so. The Gundevald affair seems to have been a raw nerve when Gregor was writing, with the suggestion that he was less than forthcoming with details because it was not safe for him to write candidly. That suggests that there were still nobles who had been involved with the failed plot, and who were in a position to make Gregory's life difficult. And it is possible that Brunhilda was one of them. At first this seems ridiculous. The noble faction that supported Gundevald's takeover attempt seems mainly to be the same one that opposed Brunhilda's influence with the king, so it's hard to see what she would have gained from introducing a new and destabilizing element to the Frankian formula. Nothing in Gregory's narrative is suggestive, but we've already seen one reason why he might keep Stumm. And furthermore, some lines in work by Fortunatus suggest that Gregory may have actually owed his appointment as bishop to Brunhilda's influence, which goes a long way to explaining his generally rosy picture of the queen, and makes him much easier to distrust. Given that rosy picture, we need to turn to the equally biased account of Fredregar, a chronicle that I have generally dismissed up until now, but now that we are reaching the end of Gregory's narrative, it is the only other comprehensive source we have. Fredregar is biased in the opposite direction from Gregory, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but let's take a look at what he says about Brunhilda and the Gundevald situation. After Gundevald had arrived in Francia, it became clear that Childebert and Guntram were of one mind. They would not recognize the newcomer's rights, and swore together to oppose him. Many Burgundian nobles attended the same meeting and swore the same oath, but very few Austrasians were present, which Guntram found suspicious. He warned Childebert not to trust his mother, and at the same time seems to have recognized that Childebert had reached his majority and should have control of the cities that his father had held. Shortly afterwards, Gundevald took over the fortress at Comines, and Guntram sent him a letter, claiming to be Brunhilda. In those days, when letters were pretty much all dictated to scribes, forgery was fairly straightforward. He gave Gundevald all kinds of terrible advice in the name of the queen, and so set Gundevald up for his eventual defeat and death. That seems pretty damning as far as Brunhilda is concerned, but the question remains, why? Why would Brunhilda support a usurper who might threaten the good order of the kingdoms? Well, as so much of life, timing is important. It's pretty clear, now that I've read all of this more carefully, that the Gundevald affair kicked off after Chilperic's death and before the noble revolt that drove Brunhilda from the court. In other words, after Guntram took Fredegund and Clothar under his protection, and before he did the same for Childebert and Brunhilda. Gundevald's claims were mainly focused in territories controlled by Guntram. If we take Fredregar at face value, then here is my thinking, and it is my thinking mostly, which you should take for what it's worth, which is the thinking of an amateur in a basement who, in spite of his pretensions, can't even read the Latin sources reliably. Not for lack of trying, by the way. Okay? Okay. So here's my thinking. Chilperic dies, and Fredegund turns to Guntram for support and protection. Brunhilda learns about this and worries about a shift in the balance of power, with Guntram and Fredegund now threatening her and her son. In fact, Guntram and Fredegund's alliance was never easy or strong, but Brunhilda wouldn't know that yet at the time, and so she panics. She's in a strong but not unassailable position in Austrasia, and feels the need to pull more of the nobility into her circle. Meanwhile, the death of Chilperic has opened up those cracks among the nobility that we've talked about before, making spaces for pretenders to insert themselves. Maybe Brunhilda knew about Gundevald beforehand. Maybe she heard of him from some other source, like Boso, who met him in Constantinople. In her rush to counter the move by Fredegund, maybe she aligned herself with the noble faction that had previously opposed her, and supported Gundevald, either morally or materially. If that's the case, it would appear that Childebert was either unaware of his mother's activities or opposed to them. I lean toward the former, if the meeting between Guntram and Childebert is accurately reported. And if that is the case, then Guntram was engaged in some pretty high-level politics of his own. He must have known that Brunhilda would not take his protection of Fredegund well. In this reading, by recognizing Childebert's majority, Guntram was setting him up as the actual, rather than just potential, head of government, and creating a new center of authority within Austrasia that Brunhilda would have to deal with. Sowing further division by advising the young king not to trust his mother, the old king was just as much an operator as she was, and he was, obviously, good at it. As I say, that's all largely speculation, but I'm enjoying this, so let's keep going and see what else we can shake out. If this scheming on behalf of Gundevald wasn't the only incident that led to Brunhilda being sent away from the Austrasian court, it almost certainly was on the list. Gundevald's failure would have discredited anyone who had supported him. Suddenly, purveyors of ass covers would have found themselves in a seller's market at the Austrasian court. Since they were not fans of Brunhilda to begin with, it would have made sense for her to be made a scapegoat and for the whole thing, possibly with Childebert turned against her. Indeed, it's hard to imagine how she could be forced out without the king's approval, or at least his turning of a blind eye. Uncomfortable though it may have been, there would have been no option then for her but to seek refuge with Guntram. Going to Neustria and Fredegund would have been literal suicide. Who knows what she said to Guntram, or what he said to her, when she appeared at his court in Orleans. It must have been agony for the proud lady. Okay, you're all thinking, but last time you said that Childebert was with the queen when she fled to Orleans, and yes, I did, but they may not necessarily have actually arrived at the same time. My guess would be that in his mother's absence, Childebert found himself unable to cope with the Austrasian nobility. She had the knowledge, the contacts, the leverage, and without her, Childebert was quickly overwhelmed by an emboldened elite. They most likely expected a puppet, and rather than knuckle under, he left, sought help from Mom and Uncle Guntram, and the three of them managed to find a way to work together, formalized in the Treaty of Andelot. It probably helped that somewhere in there Fredegund attempted to assassinate Guntram and failed, which will often sour a friendship. Against the run of play, the Guntram-Brunhilda-Childebert axis would turn out to be a strong relationship. Guntram would refer to Childebert as his son, his own sons having died of illness in 577. He also confirmed that Burgundy would pass to Childebert when he died. It wasn't perfect. There was an incident a few years later when Guntram accused his nephew of failing to abide by the treaty, but they worked it out in the end. Guntram died in 592, and as agreed, his Burgundian lands passed to Childebert. He was about 60 when he died, the elder statesman of Francia, and had been king of Burgundy for 29 years. I haven't done him justice. He was the most uniformly praised of Clothar I's children, wild in his youth but saw the light later and worked hard to be a good king. Overall, he comes across as a reasonable man and clever politician. There was that incident with the execution of his wife's doctors, but it doesn't really stand out on the list of Merovingian brutalities, and he was reluctant to do it and regretted it afterwards. Gregory seems to have enjoyed his company on a personal level, and was comfortable joking with the king. He relates a dinner he shared with Guntram where the king asked, "Tell me, is it really true that you have established warm, friendly relations between my sister Brunhilda and that enemy of God and man Fredegund?" Gregory said, "Oh, the king need not question that the friendly relations that have been fostered between them are still being fostered by them. That is to say, you may be sure that the hatred which they have borne for many a long year is still as strong as ever." I enjoy, in this particular scenario, imagining the long-haired king choking on his wine and pounding the table at Gregory's quip, a reaction I struggle to imagine from Chilperic, or from Brunhilda, for that matter. Praise of Guntram is one of the few things that Fredregar and Gregory agree on, the former eulogizing him. He passed on, as seems likely, to the eternal realm, for he had always behaved well, in good conscience, and had given alms liberally. He was generous towards prelates, humble and mild toward the ministers of Holy Church, a man of good will toward his own people and gentle towards foreigners. Because he shone with such virtues, many foreign nations magnified his name and his praise. Guntram was in fact so popular with his own people that he was almost immediately venerated as a saint, and the church of St. Marcellus in Chalons, which he founded, preserves his skull as a holy relic to this day. Well, that was a bit of a digression, but I felt the old man deserved a send-off. The inheritance of Burgundy expanded Childebert's power massively, and Brunhilda's with it. There's little evidence of any further serious strife between the two. I would imagine that the experience of shared exile and the perfidy of the Austrasians would go a long way to convince both of the importance of their relationship. That does not mean that Brunhilda didn't continue to manipulate and manage her relationships and those around Childebert. She did. But she was never again in the same kind of danger as long as her son lived. Subtle foreshadowing there. We're between chroniclers mostly during the 590s, and the period is generally poorly recorded. So we have even less detail about the goings-on in the now combined court of Austrasia and Burgundy. What we do know is that the animosity between Fredegund and Brunhilda had not abated even a little bit. The blood feud begun with the murder of Galswintha had been given even greater force by the murder of Sigebert, and now Childebert prepared to use his newly enhanced power to punish Fredegund for both. He gathered an army and made ready to invade westward. However, Fredegund apparently had a strong Italian... What? Italian? Fredegund apparently had a strong intelligence network and had ample warning of Childebert's plan, and rallied her own forces. Supposedly, she addressed the assembled Neustrian barons with the infant king Clothar suckling at her breast, which the chronology doesn't really support. Clothar would probably have been too old, but it's a nice dramatic image. Either way, she accompanied and led the army response herself, though without actually fighting. The Neustrians' quick response caught Childebert by surprise. They found the Austrasians in camp utterly unprepared. The attack was quick and decisive, the camp was plundered, many killed or captured, and just for good measure, the Neustrians went on to pillage broad swaths of Champagne. Clothar held on to his kingdom, thanks to the tenacity of his mother, and the score in the blood feud match remained firmly in Fredegund's favor. The defeat wasn't crippling, though, since Childebert was perfectly capable of raising armies for other purposes. He acquired a reputation as a war leader, along with several of the magnates around him, and Austrasia was a power with genuinely international reach. Pope Gregory wrote to both king and king's mother on various matters, and Childebert campaigned both at home and abroad regularly. There was a rebellion to put down in the Auvergne, most notably a campaign against the Lombards undertaken at the request of the Byzantine emperor. That one involved the levies of more than 20 barons and magnates and was initially very successful. The Franks captured fortresses and towns across northern Italy, reaching as far as Trento, where they were forced to turn back by an outbreak of disease. Brunhilda had very little to do with military expeditions directly, but her hand remained on the tiller of state, both domestically and abroad. Her daughter Ingund, having been driven from the Visigothic kingdom after her husband's rebellion, see episode 52, A Saintly Prince, was languishing in Africa, in diplomatic limbo. Brunhilda wrote multiple letters to the emperor seeking aid for her daughter, but to no avail. Ingund died in Carthage in 584, probably of plague. Brunhilda's standing seems to have been equal to that of the king on the diplomatic stage, judging by the tone of surviving correspondence. At home, Brunhilda kept a close eye on the people who surrounded the king. I'm sure she would argue that this was to his benefit, but his benefit and her position were closely aligned in her mind. The clearest example was in the king's love life. Obviously, the king needed an heir, but that obvious need did not sit comfortably with Brunhilda's desire to maintain her influence over her son. Any woman he took as his queen would immediately become a rival for his attention, especially if she was noble with strong connection. Fredregar alludes to Brunhilda scotching at least one proposed marriage to the daughter of a Frankish magnate, though details, as usual, are lacking. Suddenly and mysteriously, a son appears in the chronicle, born 585 or so, and named Theudebert, with no wife or consort mentioned. A wife is not mentioned at all until 587. She's a woman named Feluba, and there is simply no information about her whatsoever. She's essentially a non-entity in the historical record. She's either a Frankish woman without strong connections at court, or possibly a Visigothic princess, which, as Brunhilda would know from personal experience, placed her kin too far away to have any practical effect. A second son was born to Childebert and Feluba in that same year of 587, named Theuderic. It's often assumed that Feluba and Childebert had been married or hooked up earlier, and that both children were her son, and his, but there's enough wiggle room in the chronology to cast doubt on Theodebert's parentage. Tuck that little nugget away for later, as it will come back. Childebert was in a good place. He had control over more than half of Francia, potential pretenders had been dealt with. Through a careful policy of carrots and sticks, the nobility seemed to have quieted down. He had a pair of healthy heirs to take over when the time came, but he was only 25. I am sure, dear listeners, that in my summing up of Childebert's happy situation, you can probably detect the creak of Fortuna's wheel, and you are not imagining it. Some thought that they had been poisoned, is the sentence in the Chronicle of Fredregar, explaining the sudden death in 595 of Childebert II and his queen. That's it. King Childebert passed from this world at the age of 25. In the 23rd year of his reign, he and his wife died at the same time. Some thought that they had been poisoned. There is no hint of who initiated this murder, or why, or where, even. We can guess, of course. Austrasian nobles feeling suffocated by royal power, maybe, or Fredegund still there, dark presence in Neustria, full of malice for the line of Sigebert and Brunhilda. But it would be all guesses and speculations, and I feel like I've done my fair share of speculating this episode already. Plus, we still have ground to cover, so I will simply sum up Childebert II. He had been the king of Austrasia, in name at least, for 23 years, since he was 2, and also king of Burgundy for 4. He left behind 2 sons, Theudebert and Theuderic, aged around 10 and 8 respectively. His wife died at the same time, presumably the victim of the same poison, and so that just left Brunhilda to bury her son, and once again, at the age of 53 or 54, assume the regency for an underage prince. Following Frankish tradition, the 2 kingdoms were separated again, with the elder Theudebert receiving Austrasia, while Guntram's former territories went to Theuderic. Brunhilda slid smoothly into place as regent of Austrasia, yet another indication of how deeply embedded in the political infrastructure she was. That she remained with Theudebert isn't surprising, since Austrasia had been her home for much longer. It was where she had the strongest connections. The passing of Childebert did not go unnoticed by the neighbors, and Fredegund took the opportunity to organize an attack on the young monarchs. The Neustrians succeeded in capturing Paris outright, which up until now had been held by all the kings in common. It was pretty much the last gasp of Fredegund's malice, though. She died the following year in December 597. Aged and full of days, in the words of the chronicler. It's hard to say with any certainty how old she was, but similar to Brunhilda is likely, i.e. mid to late 50s. She was buried with Chilperic in the church now known as Saint-Germain-des-Prés in Paris, but both of them were later transferred to the Basilica of Saint-Denis. There is a mosaic cenotaph for her there, dating from the 11th century. How Brunhilda reacted to the death of her nemesis, by natural causes, is not recorded. Fredegund's passing, though, did nothing to ease the hostility between the eastern and western halves of the Frankish Empire. Both matriarchs had spent decades pouring poison into the ears of their descendants, and so the feud transcended the generations. The king of Neustria, Clothar II, was now around 13 or 14 years old and would spend a few years getting himself settled, but his intentions were pretty clearly bent on expanding his patrimony at the expense of the Theuderic and of the Theudebert. They were his nephews, by the way, though he was only 3 or 4 years older than Theudebert, and I just mention that for interest's sake, since it can be a little hard to remember that all of these folks are quite closely related. I personally would be irritated if any of my uncles were trying to steal the tools out of my garden shed, and I imagine we're talking about whole cities being at stake and the temperature being quite a bit higher when Christmas dinner rolls around. Given that the average age of Merovingian kings had fallen down into the teens, Brunhilda was unquestionably the most experienced stateswoman in Francia, which gave her a claim to be, for the moment, the most powerful person in the Latin West. In 596, Pope Gregory sent a letter addressed to both Theudebert and Brunhilda, introducing a monk named Augustin, and asking that they support him and his companions in their mission. That mission was to the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Kent, the first we've heard from Britain in quite some time. Augustine would find success across the narrow sea, converting King Ethelbert to Christianity, and becoming the very first Archbishop of Canterbury. Gregory would write to Brunhilda again later, praising her for her support of the undertaking. There is much more to say about the Frankish church and religion at the time in general, but I'm saving that for our next episode. Brunhilda's support seems to have been especially strong among the Gallo-Roman aristocrats, who were still distinct enough to be identifiable after all this time. As time went on, though, her popularity declined. It's hard to say why. It may have been dissatisfaction with the queen's efforts at centralization. It may have simply been that she was seen as arrogant and high-handed. It may have been simple sexism, or most likely a combination of all three. But the years following definitely saw an erosion of support. A case in point was a noble called Wintrion. He was a relative of Lupus, the Dux of Champagne, that we talked about last time, and so had a family tradition of support for Brunhilda. He had been one of the leaders of the armies against Fredegund as well. And yet, in 597 or thereabouts, he joined a conspiracy against the queen, was caught, and executed. Fredregar says he was entrapped by the queen, whatever that means. Really, it would make little sense for the queen to have actively looked for supporters to screw over. That would seem to be the actions of a complete nut, with no foresight whatsoever, or someone who was dangerously overconfident. Maybe it was the latter, who knows. But eventually, whatever it was, came around to bite Brunhilda. It's worth noting that what's about to happen would have been around the time that Theudebert was reaching the age of majority and beginning to take independent action as king. Maybe he found his grandmother overbearing and a little suffocating. And so, as soon as it was possible, he gave his nobility the wink and the nod that they needed to execute a little coup. Fredregar says that the Austrasian nobility drove Brunhilda out in 599. The Pope was still writing to her as regent of Austrasia as late as 602, though, and he would have been pretty well informed, so the later date is probably more likely. Indeed, the whole narrative of expulsion found in Fredregar's chronicle is suspect. Listen to this. King Theudebert and the barons of his kingdom expelled Brunhilda from the land for the murders and treachery she had performed. A poor man found her alone and distraught. She begged him to lead her to her other grandson, King Theuderic. When she arrived, she was received as his grandmother, for it seemed that he was compelled to treat her with honor. She stayed with him as long as he lived, but it would have been better for him had he banished her, for she later had him poisoned to death, as you will hear afterwards. As a reward for his service, she gave to the poor man who brought her there the bishopric of Auxerre. Okay, first of all, it is wildly unlikely that a queen, now aged in her late 50s, should be treated in such a way, no matter what she's done. Second, the Bishop of Auxerre at the time is known to us. He was named Desiderius, and elsewhere noted as having royal blood, which is a more likely origin for a bishop anyway. So the story seems to be an attempt to slander Brunhilda's judgment in the distribution of patronage. Look how she's giving high church offices to just anyone, even poor peasants. That kind of thing. It is high time, actually well past time, for me to talk in more detail about the Chronicles of Fredregar and the problems with it. I can't remember how much of this I've already said, so bear with me if I repeat myself. The Chronicle of Fredregar did not actually acquire that name until the 16th century. Until then, the document had remained unattributed. It exists today in over 30 manuscripts, the oldest dating to 715, which is pretty impressively old. About 3/4 of it consists of other copied works, many of them reworked, including Gregory's histories, along with the works of church fathers like Eusebius and St. Jerome. The parts we're interested in, Book 4, was most likely composed in Burgundy sometime between 660 and 670, because it alludes to, but does not actually record, events in the 650s. The actual chronicle ends in 642, though some manuscripts include continuations recording the roots of the Carolingian dynasty in the late 8th century. All of that sounds fine, reasonably contemporary, close to the action. The problem specifically with using Fredregar as a source for Brunhilda's activities lies in his own source, or its own source, for the material. The author seems to have drawn heavily on the life of St. Columbanus, written by a monk called Jonas of Bobbio. Columbanus will come up in next episode, but the problem is that saints' lives, as I've talked about a little before, are extremely tricky to use as historical sources. They're not intended to serve as accurate and complete reckonings of events. Rather, they were written to provide edifying examples of piety and uprightness, usually to be transmitted in sermon form to congregations. As a result, they tend to be fairly formulaic, often paralleling biblical stories and themes. Kings and queens are often set up as antagonists to the life's holy subject, which recapitulates conflicts between Old Testament prophets and kings of ancient Israel. So Brunhilda becomes, for Jonas, a Frankish Jezebel, full of cruelty and opposition to Columbanus, who is the new Elijah. Fredregar carries that same hostility forward. On the other hand, I have to admit that the Brunhilda that emerges from Fredregar's narrative, as we've seen a little bit already, is a much more compelling character than the sanitized version we find, and who always seems just a little out of focus, in Gregory's. Anyway, just some things to keep in mind. Regardless of how she made her way to Theoderic's Burgundian court, Brunhilda was understandably upset by the way she had been treated. She immediately set about acquiring influence in the new environment, presumably working the contacts she'd made in the last years of her son's reign. She also began to push the idea that Theudebert was not actually Childebert's son, but the son of a gardener. It's a pretty wild accusation, but not a new tactic among the Merovingians. Gunthar had raised suspicions about Clothar's parentage earlier, And unlike Fredegund at the time, Feluba and Childebert were not around to refute the accusation. Animosity between the two brother monarchs grew, and it's hard to see how it could have been anything other than Brunhilda's influence at work, other than the usual territorial squabbling, I suppose. Violence broke out, inevitably, with Theodoric at first coming out of it better, until external problems forced them to patch up a peace and an alliance. Those external problems had a name: Clothar II, son of Chilperic and Fredegund. His saber rattling was enough for Theodoric and Theudebert to call time on their own squabbles, which was quite an achievement given that sabers weren't really a thing yet. Calling your brother a bastard will start one kind of fight. Reminders of intergenerational blood feud will start an entirely different kind. But even that kind of fight had to be postponed. The Saxons made themselves a nuisance in the northeast, and the Gascons, or Basques, in the southwest, did so as well. And those had to be dealt with. The war with the Saxons was actually especially bloody and destructive. Finally, though, distractions set firmly to one side, the kings of Austrasia and Burgundy were prepared to beat up on their barely older uncle, now around 16, the king of Neustria. The two invaded together with a large army and met Clothar's responding force near a river called the Orvan. It is a short little squib of a river, mostly in the Ile-de-France, and soon it ran pink, with the result of a sharp, hard-fought, and bloody battle on its banks. Clothar was defeated and fled the field. Theuderic and Theudebert pressed their advantage and accepted the allegiance of a large number of Clothar's former followers. Negotiations followed closely thereafterward, and it was a walkover for the brothers. Clothar's territories were reduced to just 12 civitates between the river Oise and the Seine, essentially a small triangle of territory between Paris and Reims. The brothers high-fived, split all the loot, and then went right back to hating each other, while Clothar brooded. None of this did anything to de-escalate the spiral of hostility between the two halves of the Merovingian family. Brunhilda's attitude toward this success isn't recorded, though presumably she was pleased. Her activities in Burgundy continued very much in the mold she'd already established. She weathered the potentially dangerous moment when Theodoric came of age without difficulty, and even found him a wife. Allegedly, she bought her from a slave market, once again refusing to introduce a well-connected rival to the situation. She promoted the interests of her favorites and did her best to remove or neuter those who opposed her. Amongst the former, Fredregard named specifically a man named Prothadius, who, according to the chronicler, was also her lover, and we can probably dismiss that idea, though, since it's just too on the nose with the Jezebel trope. She pushed aside a dux named Dalmaris to replace him with Prothadius, and pressured Theodoric to give him a prominent role within the king's close household. The role in question is one that will be coming up a lot in our future discussions of the Franks: the mayor of the palace. The mayor, and you can't hear it, but I'm using the Latin word M-A-I-O-R, which means greatest or most important, was the chief manager of all of the king's household. He, and it was always he, oversaw everything necessary to make sure his lord had everything he needed, ideally before the lord knew he needed it. The position existed in most great households, and in the case of the king's household it carried enormous influence, especially as the king became more and more dependent on their mayor, but that is a story for much later. Anyway, the mayor at the time was a baron named Berthold, and he and the king were close. Rather than attacking Berthold directly then, Brunhilda suggested that Theodoric should send him to inspect some royal villas, and Berthold was duly set out on his mission, but in the process met the mayor of Clothar, a man named Landry. Brunhilda had contacts in the Neustrian court as well, and had apparently arranged this little ambush. Berthold fought bravely, but was surrounded and killed, and Bob's your uncle, Prothadius is right in there as his replacement. Prothadius was greedy, but perfectly competent, and that combination worked out well, since increasing royal revenue increased his opportunities to skim off the top. Everybody wins. Especially Brunhilda, who now had a direct channel of communication to the king, even in his most intimate moments. Prothadius didn't last long, though, killed by other barons while on an abortive campaign against Theudebert. It was the same perpetual push and pull, the magnates and their factions versus the king or queen and theirs. It's all extremely personal and cutthroat. You've probably noticed that there hasn't been a lot of policy discussion in this episode. These factions were not necessarily aligned behind one fiscal policy or another. These are mainly games of personal power. The line between political violence, that we would call war, and personal violence that we would call crime, is pretty much non-existent, and the line between personal advantage and national interest is pretty much invisible. In Frodegar's chronicle, the list of barons and household men evicted from court by Brunhilda's schemes is significant. Berthold, Uncellinus, and Volfus can be added alongside Ursus and Berethfried. Most of those will just be names to you, but they serve the point that I keep hammering that Brunhilda bent all of her political efforts toward maintaining and extending her influence over the Frankish kingdom, and the church was no different. Bishops who threatened Brunhilda's position were maneuvered out of their positions, and in the case of Desiderius of Vienne, who preached a sermon against her, were assassinated. Whenever possible, she pushed her own candidates into vacant dioceses. One of those might have been Gregory of Tours himself, as I mentioned earlier. All of this carries on in the background to the never-ending Merovingian territorial rivalries. Even without the personal animosities and lingering vendettas, Theodoric and Theudebert squabbled over land constantly. War between the two broke out in 604, 605, 608. And in 612, Theodoric had had enough, finally. He secured a promise of neutrality from Clothar, and set out to take back the lands that he had lost over the previous engagements with a huge army. Theudebert mustered his own men, of course, and the two armies met in battle, first at Toul and then at Zulpich. Both times Theudebert's force was beaten, and at Zulpich, quote, "The fighting was so bitter and intense on both sides, and they attacked each other with such heartiness, that the dead remained on their horses as though they were still alive. Nor were they able to fall, because they were packed in so closely with the living. They were pushed here and there by the movement of those battling." Beaten, Theudebert fled eastward to Cologne, but was betrayed by the locals, taken prisoner, and beheaded. We're nearing the end of Brunhilda's story, and to be honest, it is not pretty reading. There's another version of that story where Theudebert was given to Brunhilda as a prisoner, and it was she who had him murdered after a brief captivity. It was also she, according to Fredregar, that killed Theudebert's young son Merevich with a rock, with her own hands. Theudebert II was around 27 when he died, and had been king of Austrasia for 17 years. Theodoric took over all of his brother's lands, there being no male heir now. Burgundy and Austrasia were once again united, as they had been under Hildebert, minus a chunk that Theodoric ceded to Clothar in gratitude for his neutrality. Not all of Theodebert's children had been killed, though, namely his daughters. One of them apparently captured Theodoric's attention in an aesthetic appreciation and desire kind of way. Now, I am not at all comfortable with how the math works out on the ages involved here, so I'm just going to gloss over that issue without thinking too much about it. The other issue, which Brunhilda pointed out to Theodoric, was that this girl that he was lusting after and talking about marrying was, his niece. Even for the Merovingians, that was a little bit beyond the pale. And that is where it all came down. Theodoric thought about what his grandmother had said, and the penny dropped. In Fredregar's telling, he said, "Oh, you faithless woman, despised by God and all the world, against everything good, didn't you insist that he was not my brother, but the son of a shoemaker? Why did you compel me to commit a sin by killing him, and manipulated by you become my brother's murderer?" Saying this, he drew his sword and rushed at her to kill her, but the bystanders intervened and led her out of the hall, and thus she escaped, this time from imminent death. From that point on, she plotted to avenge this humiliation and to bring about his death. She saw a chance to do it when he was taking a bath. To the ministers who surrounded him, whom she corrupted with promises and gifts, she gave poisons, and ordered them to give them to the king to drink when he had come out of his bath. The king drank the poison that they offered him, and died instantly without confessing, without repenting for the great sins that he had committed throughout his whole life. Theodoric had had 4 sons by various mistresses, and Brunhilda's plan was that Austrasia would pass to one of these, Sigebert, presumably the oldest. The rest of the kingdoms would pass to Clothar. Clothar was having none of it, though. Sigebert was illegitimate as far as he was concerned, and he would have the whole kingdom, thank you very much. Brunhilda was prepared to put up a fight, and made preparations. Much of the Austrasian nobility, though, had had it up to here. Sigebert was indeed illegitimate, and even if not, he would certainly be under the thumb of Brunhilda, and it would just be more of the same. Enough was enough. Plans were laid, and plots were hatched. When the two armies met, anticlimax was the word of the day. A handful of Austrasians had already joined Clothar, and those that remained on Sigebert's side abandoned the field without a fight. Sigebert and 2 of his brothers, Corba and Merovius, were captured. A fourth, who happened to have had the best horse, escaped and was never heard from again. Clothar proceeded to have 2 of the remaining executed, but Meroveus he spared, and sent to be brought up and educated in his own household. And that was because, fascinatingly, Clothar was the boy's godfather. The jig was finally up. Had the battle gone differently, had there been a battle at all, really, then the defeat and probable killing of Clothar would have been the icing on the cake of Brunhilda's blood feud. Fredegund's son made to pay for the wrongs she had visited upon Brunhilda and her family. As it was, Clothar was equally prepared to bring matters to a conclusion. He brought Brunhilda before the assembled nobility of Francia, and accused her of causing the deaths of 10 kings, including her husband Sigebert, her son, and her grandsons. He undoubtedly laid murders at her door that were really his mother's work, but now was not the time to be fair and balanced. All of it would end today. This was not a trial. Brunhilda was clearly guilty, and all that there was to be done was determine how she would die. The method chosen would fit perfectly into the traditions of Germanic heroic poetry and Norse saga, i.e., it was public and it was brutal. The aged queen, nearly 70 now, was tied to a horse and dragged through the army camp until she was dead, and then for a while longer. It was an undignified end for anyone, and especially for a woman who had been at the center of Frankish politics for half a century. So what do we think? At the end there, Brunhilda does seem to have gone pretty thoroughly off the rails, if we take Fredegund at face value. And even if we allow for some exaggeration, I think we can say that she was a pretty ruthless operator, concerned mainly with her own position, secondarily with the standing of her family. The running feud with Fredegund and her son probably did contribute a toxic element that intensified conflicts. There was no clear line between state policy and personal power and position. It's got to be said that in this, she probably was absolutely no different from any other powerful person in the Frankish courts, or in any courts, for that matter. Assassination and violence were in the air, and the nobles competed and fought with each other with just as much cynicism as the Merovingian royals did. Even by the worst interpretation, up until the very end there, Brunhilda mainly gives the impression of amorality and a talent probably for self-rationalization. But there's very little sign of sadism. By way of contrast, Gregory tells of one Frankish magnate who at dinner would make a servant hold a lit candle between his thighs until it burned him, and of another who buried a peasant couple alive because they had married without his permission. I'm not making excuses for Brunhilda. If she really did murder her own great-grandson with a rock, surely a line had been crossed somewhere quite a ways back. I'm just making the point that it was a violent society, and one with very few limits at all on the behavior of the elite. Brunhilda stands out for a couple of reasons. First, because she was a queen and had access to much wider resources with which to manipulate the body politic. And two, because she was a woman, and there has hardly ever been a time when chroniclers and commentators have not applied the old double standard, namely that ambition, aggression, and cunning may be admirable in a man, but are detestable in a woman. And third, just for her extraordinary toughness, tenacity, bloody-mindedness, and staying power. The presentation of Brunhilda and Fredegund, and in a different light, Radegund, makes it clear that queens were significant and powerful figures in Frankish politics, and that they were feared and respected by all. Now it's time at last to leave Brunhilda, and leave the relentless slog of Frankish politics too. But we're not quite done with Francia just yet. We've talked about the bishops as political actors before, but in the next episode, I want to talk more about religion more generally. What did going to Gregory of Tours' church actually look like, sound like, feel like? We'll talk about the question of how far Christianity had actually penetrated into the countryside, and about the position of the Pope in all of it. All that remains for me, then, is to thank you all for listening and for supporting. Special thanks, as always, to contributors on Ko-fi.com. It's been a while since I've done this, so there is a list, which is fairly gratifying. So thank you to Lisa, Einar, Jeff, Jason, Matthias, Don, and the winner of Best Username, Karate Moonsuit. Thanks also, and always, to my beloved monthly contributors Alex, Jordan, John, Dusty, Jesse, Paul, Toasty, Barchester, Micaiah, and new contributor and runner-up for Best Username, Muggy-Doo. 1,000 thank yous upon you and all of your kin. Until next time, take care.